Hey guys, Mike here. So today's cult classic review is 1991's Barton Fink, starring John Turturro as Barton Fink. In Barton Fink, a renowned New York playwright is sent out to Hollywood to write for the movies, but then discovers the darker side of Hollywood. And so we have Barton Fink. So guys, this is a movie in this series that before watching and reviewing it today, I had not seen it before, nor had I ever heard of this one. So again, this is another one I didn't really know what it was about going into it, so I had no real expectations for it. So, what did I think of Barton Fink? Well, I gotta say, I did like John Turturro in this movie, even though I didn't like his character. Now, the reason I didn't like his character wasn't because of any bad performance. It's more the fact of that I just didn't like his character, because he was a very self-absorbed, arrogant man. Because he constantly says that he wants to tell stories about the average man and really put them on a pedestal for once. But he doesn't really do it from any sense of sincerity or really wanting to have their voices be heard. It's more for the fact of making himself seem important, and for the fact that no one else seems to be writing about them. Because he gets introduced to John Goodman's character, who was really good in this film, but more on him later. And John Goodman's character is the average man that he seems to want to write about. But as John Goodman's character starts to really want to connect with him more and tell him more of his stories, Barton only seems to really want to hear the sound of his own voice. Because as John Goodman starts to talk, he's just like, see, that's what I'm talking about. Just the oppression of the little man. Not really listening to what he's saying. Not writing down any notes and not really seeming to respond to anything that he says. And for the longest time, Goodman's character just kind of brushes it off and is just like smiling through it. That is until right towards the very end, he just calls him out on it, which I thought was brilliant. Now, he doesn't really go into much detail on how he calls it out. He just says, you don't listen. Which I thought was just enough, but I would have really liked for him to call him out even more. Like, say, the reason why he's not listening. But for the simple fact of him acknowledging that Barton doesn't listen was excellent, I thought. But the point where I'd say the film kind of falls apart a bit for me is that it tries to do too many things. It tries to be a story about writer's block, a buddy-buddy story, a love romance, and then later on, a murder mystery. And for me, it doesn't really delve deep enough into any of these stories. It just does enough on each one of these points to be interesting enough. But I would say that where it doesn't actually go enough into any of these points, it does tell a consistent and concise story. Because it doesn't not delve into these stories through any lack of logic or forgetting to tell the stories. It's more the fact that it just wants to kind of tell multiple stories at once. Because the love interest part, I don't think there was any genuine attraction there because they had actual attraction for each other. I think it was more the fact that he only was interested in her because she's basically the only woman that he's seen in a while. And for her, she's just kind of attracted to these broken men. Which, upon further reflection, is fairly interesting and somewhat of a unique story. But actually, I do think it's a bit much to say that they were in love. But the two-faced nature of Hollywood's storyline, I thought was quite interesting. And I think this was best represented by Michael Lerner's character in this, who did receive an Oscar nomination for this. And while I thought it was a fairly interesting and entertaining performance, I wouldn't have gone so far as to say that it deserved an Oscar nomination. But in any case, good character, because at the start, he's extremely friendly towards Barton. Even though he's never met him and doesn't really seem to know much about his work, he puts him on this massive pedestal. Writers of the future, you're an absolute genius, we will do everything to accommodate you. And he says that he wants a true Barton Fink story, but really what he wants is for him to just tell another generic story and have Barton Fink's name attached to it, just to get more people to see it. And as soon as Barton actually presents his story to Michael Lerner's character, he immediately dismisses it, thus showing the true nature of Hollywood, that they only really want to hear the sound of their own voices. And with the writer's block story element, there wasn't really that much to delve into, because he's constantly doubting himself. He just thinks that he only has the one good story in him, and just everything is a distraction, and he just never really kind of gets the story that he wants, until towards the end, that is. But again, the reason why this story doesn't completely fall apart is because Barton's character remains consistent. Even though he's got quite a few people trying to help him out, he just remains completely disinterested in them. Like, the studio tells him that they want a wrestling story, and then Goodman's character tells him the basics of wrestling and could tell him some interesting stories. But because Barton's so self-absorbed in the sound of his own voice, he just really isn't interested in it. And again, I thought that was really good. But I didn't really know what to make of the ending. I didn't know whether it was literal or more of an abstract, figurative kind of ending. If they were saying that this ending was completely literal and everything that happened did happen, then it was a completely awful ending, because it doesn't really explain all that much, and it's just a bit too silly. However, if they were going for a bit more of a non-linear, more of an abstract ending, and just kind of leaving a bit open to your own interpretation, then it was completely fine. I really quite like the ending. And I do prefer to think of it more of an abstract ending as more of a literal one, because it does open it a bit more up to interpretation, which, like I've said before, I don't mind an open interpretation if they first tell a consistent narrative, because it's very clear that they've told their story and they're also leaving it open to your own interpretation, which is brilliant. And while I wasn't amazed by the ending, I was really impressed with how they portrayed it at the end. And it does again show off the amazing performance of John Goodman's character, who for me was the biggest standout in the entire film. Even though John Turturro and Michael Lerner were really good in this one, John Goodman was the one who really stood out most to me. So guys, would I consider Barton Fink a personal cult classic, and would I recommend that you guys should see it? This movie definitely has a lot of great qualities to make it a cult classic, and I can see why it's become one. Interesting characters, fairly decent setting, and at times it is fairly funny, but I wouldn't say that the comedy was the strongest part of this film. I just wouldn't consider this one a personal cult classic, because while I did enjoy Barton Fink definitely a bit more than I initially thought I was going to, it just didn't really have that personal cult classic feel for me. Because again, even though I enjoyed it, I wouldn't probably watch this one again. But as for whether or not you guys should see it, I wouldn't say to actively avoid this one, because it definitely has a lot of great qualities, and its pros definitely do outweigh its cons. It's just not one that I would say that you immediately need to see and that this one will ultimately stand the test of time. It's just a fairly decent movie, which I would say, if you're interested in watching it, give it a watch. Because at the end of the day, Barton Fink isn't a bad movie. Okay guys, that's my cult classic review of Barton Fink. Do you love it? Do you hate it? Whatever you think, drop it in the comments below. Until next time, I've been Michael. See ya.